Welcome back to the Game Collection. I'm SuperDerek, and Lufia II might just be the last great Super Nintendo RPG that I've never played. Until now. One of the very first RPGs that I ever reviewed was Lufia and the Fortress of Doom. It was a modest RPG made by Neverland that introduced me to the concept of nested fetch quests, and while ultimately charming in its own right, it took about 10 years and 100 other RPG reviews for me to build up the courage necessary to go in for seconds with the follow-up prequel, Lufia II: Rise of the Sinistrals. And what was I waiting for? This was awesome!
Back in the day, some regions actually never got the original title, Lufia in the Fortress of Doom, but surprisingly, Lufia 2 ended up coming out worldwide. In those regions that skipped the original game though, Lufia 2, Rise of the Sinistrals, is simply known as Lufia, whereas the original series was actually called Estpolis. Why they changed it originally, I can't say, but considering the titular party member from the original game is not playable in Lufia 2, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that renaming the series was probably a bad choice. Maybe they wanted to sound like Zelda or something. Who am I kidding? This was Localization 101 back in the Super Nintendo era. Of course they wanted to evoke Zelda imagery. I can't verify that, of course. The only real research I did for this video was to play the game, but the vibe checks out at least. Anyway, as many people will tell you when discussing Lufia 2, Lufia and the Fortress of Doom, quote-unquote, spoils the ending of Lufia 2, which raises a whole other series of questions about whether a developer can spoil their own ending, especially in the context of a prequel that didn't even exist as a twinkle in the creator's eye at the time. Maybe we'll tackle that discussion another day. Get subscribed so you don't miss it. But I suppose that it does bear mentioning one way or the other that if you play Lufia 1, it begins more or less with the ending of Lufia 2, beat for beat. If that bugs you, maybe skip Lufia 1. In fact, maybe skip Lufia 1 regardless, but I'm digressing again. Lufia 2 takes place about 100 years prior to the events of Lufia 1, in the world of Estpolis. While the land itself is not explicitly named within Lufia 1 or 2, based on the Japanese title, we can just infer that the land is called Estpolis, but I'm likely to call it Estopolis again if we go on too long. If I do, just pretend I'm using the Japanese pronunciation of the word. The events of Lufia 2 cover the story of the legendary hero Maxim and his companions as they discover the existence of legendary super beings, who historically were mostly good, but this quartet are evil and call themselves the Sinistrals. The story picks up with Maxim, a naturally gifted fighter living in a small town. He's a renowned monster hunter, taking local jobs to keep the land safe. All seems fine and well until Maxim is approached by a mysterious woman, Iris, who sends him off on a quest to defeat a growing threat. Along the way, he makes some friends of a cast of interesting characters, bumps into bumbling thieves, solves problems between nations, and is generally doing good things in his journey across the world. All of this naturally culminating in the acquisition of powerful allies, mystical armor and weapons, and of course, playing slot machines for hours upon hours on end, as any good hero does. Looking back over my time playing the game over the last year or so, my thoughts are a little disjointed, much like the distribution of my streaming dates on Twitch. This occurred for a variety of personal reasons that probably aren't the fault of the game itself, but even so, the game feels relatively episodic, following a pattern of find a new town, discover a town's problem, go to the tower or cave nearby with the thing needed to resolve the problem, get to the end of the dungeon, fight and probably kill the bad guy, and return to town to discover your next destination. And while episodic it may be, it's a stark improvement over those aforementioned nested fetch quests for Illumina that dominated my memories of Lufia 1. In fact, that episodic nature isn't even a complaint in the broad scale, as this was actually a pretty common style of RPG of the era and lent itself as well as it could to those odd and irregular play sessions that I was talking about before. At no point did I need to try and remember the full context of what the situation was, because only the basic plot points really mattered, and remembering my current task. NPCs did a good job of reminding me of where I needed to head next, so if you don't get to play RPGs very often, this could be the perfect kind of game to spend some time with when you next get one of those odd and irregular opportunities. My personal and subjective experience with the game does leave me wishing that the style of storytelling were a bit more interconnected though. Another creator that I watch from time to time, Totally Not Mark, recently talked about the differences between and then storytelling as opposed to and therefore storytelling. And I think that difference really drives home what feels missing from this particular story. It felt like there was a lot of and then this happened, and then that happened, and less and therefore the crew decided to do this other thing. I don't have specific examples I can recall that aren't potentially spoiler territory, but as always with mid-90s localization jobs, it's entirely possible that the stilted dialogue and awkward declarations of where to go next are constraints imposed by the storage chip costs and sizes available. I won't say that this localization is bad, but the text often feels utilitarian rather than literary. Even so, the cast of playable characters mostly had big and distinctive personalities. The budding antagonistic bromance between the warrior Guy and the elf Artie kept giving me Gimli and Legolas flashbacks. Decker is just a lovable, strong oaf of a barbarian, and Ceylon the Wizard is a wizard? Warrior lady? Well, her depiction throughout the game is honestly kind of all over the place. Sometimes she's a powerful caster, other times she's a powerful warrior. I suppose the same could be said of Maxim, as the game isn't preoccupied with fitting everyone into their archetypes that we all kind of take for granted today. Which is cool, I guess, not because they're particularly well-rounded, and instead it's just kind of because they haphazardly toggle between the two competing archetypes. Like the localization team couldn't really make a choice. Is she a strong, independent Amazoness, or a demure and heartfelt sorcerer? Yes, but not at the same time. One of the more unique story beats that Lufia II handles unexpectedly well is the trope of unrequited love. I don't want to dive into the story too much for the sake of spoilers, but there is a one-sided relationship in the game that plays out quite a bit differently from the typical RPG where, of course, the other person eventually falls in love because fiction. As in real life, not all unrequited love is destined to be returned. It's a healthy and refreshing take on a trope that adds real depth to these characters, so props for that. Overall, the characters were fun to experience and will leave a lasting impression. One thing about Lufia II that I didn't realize going in is that this turn-based RPG also has some elements from other RPG and adjacent genres mixed throughout, giving it a very distinctive feel, especially among other classic Super Nintendo RPGs. Outside of dungeons, the game plays like any other typical RPG. Explore towns, talk to NPCs, random encounters on the world map unless you're in a submarine or an airship. Just mentioning those here because they're awesome and I'm not sure I'll remember to mention it elsewhere. But once you enter a dungeon, Lufia II shifts gears and gets rid of the random encounters. Instead, enemies are displayed within the dungeon and they move around with different patterns, some reacting to your own movements, others with different behaviors, and they only move when you do, using a grid-based tile movement system. I think some people call this synchronous movement and reminds me of some mystery dungeon or roguelike mechanics, but for the most part, dungeons are handcrafted and heavily feature the use of puzzles. It's nice that while puzzle solving, you can pretty much clear a room of enemies first rather than having to context switch between puzzle solving and combat. The older I get, the less patience I have for that kind of stuff, so this was super welcome and reminded me of how much I enjoyed the puzzles of the Golden Sun games. There's a whole other piece of this game that also completely derailed my playthrough for weeks, and it bears mentioning here. The Ancient Cave in Lufia II is almost its own game entirely. featuring a 99-floor dungeon with randomly generated floors with randomly generated loot. You go in with almost no gear or equipment and everyone is at level 0. There are no save points within it, few healing points, and the treasures and enemies are hard to anticipate. If you die, you lose everything and you start over from the very beginning. But if you find rare items in blue chests specifically, you can take those with you when you leave voluntarily through one of the randomly placed exits. And best of all, most items in these blue chests are endgame loot that you can acquire at essentially the midpoint of the game. So if you want to throw yourself into this task for hours and hours and completely derail your actual quest, you can find yourself quite overpowered with awesome treasure for all the remainder of your playthrough, even though you lose all of your levels upon exiting the dungeon. Yeah, it's basically a completely optional roguelike plunked right down in the middle of a JRPG, and it's phenomenal, even though there are like no puzzles to be found in it. And I think this is one of the more enduring aspects of Lufia II these days, garnering speedrunners to take on the ancient caves as quickly as possible for sport and glory. Combat within Lufia II is pretty dang interesting. On the surface level, it's a turn-based RPG where you enter commands at the beginning of the turn, and then enemies and allies perform those commands in order of their speed stats. That idiosyncrasy of Lufia II, where felled enemies can still be targeted, wasting player character turns, has been mercifully discarded as a game mechanic befitting of a much earlier era of RPG. The really unique draw here is the use of IP. What does IP stand for? Nobody really knows for sure, and therefore the IP meter falls for anything. But for the sake of my own sanity, I think of it as the I'm pissed meter, because the meter goes up when you get hit, and then you can use those points to execute skills bestowed upon your character by the weapons and armors that they have equipped. Most weapons and armors that you find throughout the game, as opposed to buying them, have these special abilities, and some of them are quite powerful or rare. Abilities like being able to strike 2, 3, or even 8 times in a single turn, or to attack all enemies, or use uncommon debuff abilities that you can't learn on your own. In fact, few spells, if any, can actually be learned through just leveling up. You actually have to buy them from various vendors like equipment. Interesting choices being made here, but I'm here for it. I know I already mentioned the puzzles a few minutes ago, but it really bears repeating. The puzzles in Lufia 2 are no joke, and if you're not a puzzle-loving RPG fan, I know you do exist out there, this game is probably not going to be your cup of tea. Some puzzles are of the Sokoban push block variety, others are a bit more Zelda-esque, requiring the use of key items to explode walls or shoot grass with flaming arrows and figure out specific sequence of button presses needed in order to not fall asleep. Not again. And then there's even a sliding tile puzzle from the pits of damnation itself, but it's actually, and honestly, refreshing to see how many different kinds of puzzles there are. The sheer variety of puzzles and escalating complexity is wild considering how many RPGs I've played before that never featured any of these kind. Granted, many of them are real head scratchers that will leave you frustrated. I had to look up the solution to that sleeping grass puzzle, and even then, the button inputs required were so precise and meticulous that my old worn-out D-pad membranes were not up to scratch for that level of precision. I almost wish I had emulated the game instead, if only for the ability to use a keyboard instead. And also for another reason that I'll go into in due time. In the spirit of helping make RPGs more accessible to more people, I also wanted to talk about the challenge rating of this game. Between the extra gameplay mechanics that are pretty unique to Lufia 2 and the hardcore puzzle solving elements, I would not recommend Lufia 2 as a game for beginners. While I'm not entirely sure how difficult the actual combat is, considering that I loaded up on blue chest loot from the ancient cave early on, making the rest a relative cakewalk, I suppose that's at least an indication that, for the most part, combat difficulty is largely within the player's control. Even so, probably not a good choice for beginners. A determined beginner could probably force themselves through the game, and guides do go a long way toward making it more approachable, but I still think I would place this above average in terms of overall difficulty. You'll hit roadblocks often that you'll have to think through or slog through if you're inexperienced, but I think you could do it. But you might enjoy the experience more if you have a few other RPGs under your belt first. From a visuals standpoint, Lufia II is pretty alright. It's a nice step up from the original Lufia 1 and has a bit more variety in the different towns and locales that previously all felt pretty samey. It's not the prettiest Super Nintendo RPG, but it's not the ugliest either. Perfectly serviceable, I'd say. In combat is where the visuals become a bit more interesting though, featuring large enemy portraits and super cool spell effects that also, coincidentally, remind me of those animations found in the Golden Sun games to an extent. Combat is displayed in a first-person perspective a la Dragon Quest, but you can at least see your party members at the bottom of the screen, attacking, incurring damage, casting spells, just like with Lufia 1, and I dig it. The music of Lufia 2 is, in my opinion, a double-edged sword because this music is great. Holy cow, I love every single track, all 4 of them. Okay, so that's clearly an exaggeration of the problem. There's actually a pretty good breadth of music found throughout the game. I honestly think that the issue with the soundtrack isn't so much the quantity of music, but rather how those songs are dispersed. There's a whopping 60 plus tracks in the game, but only 3 of those tracks are battle themes, and only 1 of those gets played for the vast majority of the game. And that's a big problem, because I love that song. I loved that song. But I have over 50 hours of stream recordings of playing this game, and who knows how many untold extra hours were spent off stream grinding my way through the ancient cave that aren't included because I died on the 70th floor? As someone who is not a speedrunner of the ancient cave, I can assure you that that is a non-trivial number. So all of that is to say that I love the battle theme, but whoever was in charge of distributing these battle themes across the game deserves, well, honestly, they deserve some grace from angsty players because we're all a little too quick to get angry sometimes. It didn't ruin the game for me, but oh boy, I'm ready for some variety now. However, what almost ruined the game for me, and for a lot of other people, has to be the awful glitch or bug that raises its ugly head at 2 key points in the game. For all actual physical cartridges of the game in the US, I'm not sure about European versions though, at 1 key point when you make it to the 99th floor of the ancient cave, the encounter with the secret boss at the bottom of the cave takes place in a weird, glitched out map. It's mostly navigable easily and is just a short sequence, but later in the game when you get close to acquiring that special ancient sword of legend, the entire open map is completely glitched, and not just a little bit. It takes place in the hellscape of broken tile sets that I can only describe as a home only the legendary Pokemon Missingno could feel comfortable in. Luckily, there were no monsters to encounter here, no puzzles to solve, but navigation was practically a puzzle all its own. Eventually, hugging the walls, I stumbled my way to where I needed to be, but let me tell you, few SNES RPGs had me holding my breath like Lufia II as I prayed that the game didn't crash on me in these crucial moments, as both times these crazy glitches took me completely unaware. Luckily, there are fan patches of ROMs that address these bugs, so maybe you should look into that option if you'd rather get a experience untainted by poor quality assurance. Ultimately, Lufia II Rise of the Sinistrals is great, not because it is flawless, but in spite of its flaws, the mark of a truly good RPG. Every diamond in the rough has a scuff or an imperfection. Seeking out actual perfection will only yield disappointment, but instead of perfection, we have a game with charm and character. If you're still on the fence, here's a short version of why it's worth your time. From block-pushing brain teasers to Zelda-esque Switch puzzles, it's a dream for anyone craving more than just mindless monster mashing. Turn-based battles with the IP gauge keeps things feeling fresh, plus you can customize special attacks through your gear. There's unrequited love, a band of bumbling thieves, and a legendary hero's journey with enough variety to keep you interested. The ancient cave can easily steal hours of your life away with its 99 floors of randomly generated glory and gear, and a charming SNES era aesthetic with a stellar, if repetitive, soundtrack and big, colorful battle sprites.
And if that sounds like your cup of tea, then I cannot recommend Lufia II enough. It's one of the last great JRPGs of the Super Nintendo that I hadn't played, excluding the wealth of Super Famicom exclusives, and closing the book on this game personally feels like the end of an era. And the end of an era in more ways than one, considering I started this game 8 months ago. But with every end comes a new beginning, and I hope that you've enjoyed this era, because I'm ready to start a new one next time in the Game Collection.